Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Great Mars Hill Bank Robbery, The True Adventures of Maine's Zaniest Criminal, by Ron Chase, narrated by Patrick Lawlor. Prologue. I first learned of Bernard Patterson and the Mars Hill Bank robbery while reading a series of 3 newspaper articles in the Bangor Daily News during the fall of 1973. His story immediately captured my interest. At the time, I was living in a rented mobile home in Calais, Maine, with my wife and infant son. My career with the Internal Revenue Service had just begun, and we were barely subsisting on my $6,500 per year salary. The fascinating, dramatic, yet often humorous tale about a fearless former Vietnam War hero turned improbable bank robber who miraculously escaped to experience a succession of riotous intercontinental escapades while on the lam for nearly 7 months was simply unbelievable. I remember thinking his story would rival the most exciting, compelling adventure novel. He seemed to be a real-life version of Don Quixote, Butch Cassidy, and Robin Hood, all rolled into one implausible package. In truth, I related to him, and, with some reservations, admired him. Both born in 1947, we grew up in working-class families in rural Maine communities. Both of us had checkered, generally unsatisfactory public school experiences and ended up in the Army as 19-year-olds during the peak of the Vietnam War. At that juncture, our paths varied. Bernard was sent directly into the maelstrom of Vietnam, where he experienced several years of combat, while mine was a much more benign exposure, with tours of duty in Korea and Alaska. However, like hundreds of thousands of other young men who served during the Vietnam era, we both returned disillusioned, distrustful of our government institutions, and with an abiding sense that we no longer fit neatly into the society we had left. His madcap anti-establishment, albeit criminal actions, seemed to speak for all of us. There appeared to be some convoluted nuance of justice in his escape, the unrestrained, extravagant spending, and casual, devil-may-care approach to the entire process. I never forgot Bernard's adventures. An inveterate storyteller, whenever I traveled through Mars Hill on my way to or from an outdoor expedition in northern Maine or eastern Quebec, I invariably related the unbelievable events of his story to my usually doubtful companions. That I am occasionally prone to embellishing a good story may have contributed to their skepticism. A companion on some of my canoe trips in northern Maine and a frequent victim of my storytelling, my youngest son Adam, may know the facts as I used to relate them almost as well as I. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this tale is that the facts are so incredible they eliminate any need for embellishment. In January 2013, while on a winter mountaineering trip in New Hampshire, I had a fortuitous encounter with Peter King. Overhearing him talking with a companion about a fellow he had worked with who had robbed a bank in northern Maine and was the most reckless person he'd ever met, immediately caught my attention. Striking up a conversation, I asked if the bank he'd robbed had been in Mars Hill. Affirming that it was, we had an extended conversation about his experiences working and socializing with Bernard. Before it ended, I announced my intent to write a book about him and the robbery. Peter ended our conversation by stating that he liked and admired Bernard and counted him as a friend. That was an observation that has been regularly repeated by virtually everyone that I've interviewed who knew him intimately. Bernard was a good and loyal friend who engendered that same fidelity in people who befriended him. He was exceedingly likable, humorous in a caustically sarcastic manner, and despite his actions and behavior, perceived to be a good guy. When I first contacted one lifelong friend, his initial response was that he would not be party to anything that degraded Bernard. As much as a half-century later, people who knew him invariably say, Bernard was a friend. The late 60s and early 70s was a turbulent period for many in America, but probably none more than returning combat veterans. Dramatic social change, rapidly evolving in a constricted time frame, it was punctuated by strident, sometimes violent disagreement over the moral acceptability and strategic value of the Vietnam War. Anti-war sentiment dominated the social and political landscape. Barely men, thousands of rural Maine teenagers like Bernard, who entered the service in the mid-60s, left a sheltered world of school dances, conservative values, and relatively secure circumstances, although the latter was not true of Bernard. Only the most daring among them had experimented with alcohol or dabbled in sex, and marijuana use was almost non-existent. While in the military, particularly Vietnam, many were exposed to a world of hard drugs, pervasive prostitution, corruption, desperate poverty, and incomprehensible violence. Bernard experienced all of these in the extreme. However, unlike veterans from previous wars, Vietnam War returnees encountered a very different environment than the one they left, one of changing mores, heavy drug use, and hostility toward veterans. Resentments, antisocial behavior, and adaptability problems on the part of many veterans often resulted. The Vietnam War was also unique in recent American history, as it was a class war. World War II had been fought by a cross-section of young men from all segments of society. This was also true of the Korean War, although to a somewhat lesser extent. For most of the Vietnam War, student draft deferments had the effect of exempting much of the middle and upper classes from service. Although there are no definitively reliable statistics, it's generally accepted that in excess of 75% of the enlisted men who served in Vietnam were from working-class or poverty-level backgrounds, and that only about 10% of the young men who came of draft age during the Vietnam War actually served in the military. This, too, fueled resentment among many Vietnam-era veterans. By all accounts, Bernard came from financially poor circumstances. It's not surprising that the justification he used for robbing the bank was to forcibly take out a loan after he was reputedly denied college education benefits by the Veterans Administration. He had been promised education benefits, and he believed he was entitled to them. Frustrated, he took action. Bernard was a genuine war hero. From 1966 to 1970, he served with the 25th Infantry Division in the Cu Chi sector of Vietnam, and then the 101st Airborne near Hue. Only required to complete a one-year term, he volunteered for 2 additional tours. Several accounts indicate that his request to volunteer for a 4th tour was denied based on concerns about the state of his mental health. Perhaps the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, had already manifested themselves. An infantryman, he volunteered as a tunnel rat, probably the most dangerous military assignment in the Vietnam War. Given the attenuated nature of the tunnel complexes, tunnel rats were invariably small in stature. Bernard was 5 foot 3 inches tall and weighed about 140 pounds. A lifelong friend described him as brazen and brave. He was a small guy, but you instinctively knew, don't mess with him. Bernard was also utilized as an enemy tracker above ground. Another very hazardous duty, he and his well-trained tracker dog would be airlifted by helicopter to an area the Viet Cong was suspected to inhabit. If the enemy was located, he would radio the helicopter to pick him and the dog up before the area was targeted with heavy ordnance. The tracker dogs were so valued, he speculated that the Army was more concerned about the dog's safety than his. Bernard excelled in this violent, perilous world. A friend who encountered him at Camp Eagle in Vietnam characterized Bernard as quiet, laid back, and easygoing, but fearless. And after his military service, he just didn't care. While one family member states that Bernard emphatically denied any PTSD problems, it seems quite likely that PTSD played a significant role in his decisions and behavior after leaving the military. One expert with a background dealing with combat veterans indicates that his was classic PTSD behavior. Regardless of the motivations, Bernard's was an epic journey and a story worth telling. 1. Reflections. Bernard could learn more in 2 days than the rest could in a week. A teacher. More than 35 years later, he could still vividly remember those harrowing episodes in the tunnels of Gucci. Silently crawling in the dark, trying to regulate and muffle his breathing, all of his senses in a state of extreme hypervigilance. Perspiring profusely in the steamy filth, beads of sweat filling and partially blinding his eyes, the ghastly, foul, nauseating smell permeating the thin air, he inched his way through the narrow tunnels. Flicking his flashlight on and off as he crawled through mud in search of signs of booby traps, while carrying a .38 caliber revolver in his other hand and a bayonet strapped to his leg. The enemy was somewhere ahead of him, maybe waiting in ambush, or if he was lucky and sufficiently wily, he'd be undetected and surprise them. Either way, it was kill or be killed. There were no second chances in that hellish subterranean world of unyielding, appalling rules. Perpetually calm and unafraid, he'd always been the killer. Bernard had been one of the few tunnel rats to survive unscathed, at least physically. At age 56, Bernard Patterson was still relatively young, living in a recently built home on Young Lake Road in Westfield, Maine, with his youthful fiancée and their infant daughter. Life for him was in renewal. His had been a circuitous odyssey that had begun just a few miles away in Prestile on January 14, 1947. An inauspicious and anonymous beginning, few would have predicted the improbable events that defined his life. During the warm summer days of 2003, his health was waning. Still regularly using marijuana and chain-smoking unfiltered Pall Malls, Bernard reflected back on his exceptional life. Having remarked several times to friends that a book should have been written about him, or even better, a movie made, he'd tried to sell his story, but couldn't get anyone to commit to serious money. Incessantly calculating the best possible option in all aspects of life, and convinced he had a valuable commodity with which to bargain, he refused to sell his story cheap. Unfortunately for him, there had been no enthusiastic, well-heeled writers or movie makers to come forward with a lucrative proposal. Born into a poor family, childhood friends and acquaintances remember him as reticent, unobtrusive, and likable. He was quiet with people he didn't know, but he was personable with friends. Girls liked him. 2 attributes stood out. He was fearless and very intelligent. Although he was a little guy, it was universally understood, even at an early age, Bernard was no one to mess with. Dysfunctional would aptly characterize Bernard's childhood. As one friend succinctly put it, he lacked good role models. His father was an intermittent laborer, and his mother worked odd jobs when she was emotionally able and opportunity availed. Struggling with mental illness throughout much of her life, Glenna Patterson signed herself into the Bangor Mental Health Institute on several occasions when coping was no longer an option. Bernard had 3 brothers and 2 sisters. Mars Hill potato farmer Dwayne Grass remembers him, his brother Bobby, and mother picking potatoes in their family fields for many years when Bernard was a kid. During that era, it was common for whole families to pick potatoes. For many, the potato-picking income was an essential part of their sustenance, used to buy clothes or pay for other necessary living expenses. or the money would be set aside as a safeguard against possible emergencies during the upcoming long, cold northern Maine winter. The Patterson family lived hand to mouth and immediately used any income for their daily wants and needs. Money left over for a rainy day was a luxury for only the more fortunate to contemplate, never an alternative for them. While potato picking was an integral part of northern Maine culture during his youth, it was rugged, demanding work. Up at 4 a.m, potato trucks would gather pickers between 5 and 5:30 a.m. Always dark and usually cool, if not cold, unless workers were favored enough to get one of the treasured spots in a heated cab with the driver, they had a very chilly trip standing on an open platform in the back of the truck. Holding on to barrels or ropes secured to the truck bed, it was a dusty, windy ride to the fields. Swallowing blowing dirt and eyes filled with grit was an occupational hazard that finally ended when work began, unless it was a windy day. If the truck didn't break down, which frequently happened, picking generally started at 6 a.m. Seasoned pickers stood bending into their work. The inexperienced and many children knelt, paying a painful price as the often frozen ground rubbed skin off their knees. The choice was a persistently sore back or raw, bloodied knees. Veteran field hands understood that while kneeling minimized back pain, it was less efficient and guaranteed a poor paycheck. Days often began with frigid temperatures and sometimes ended as warm as 80 degrees. Heavily dressed for the morning cold, the insulated clothing resulted in unpleasant overheating if there was a warm afternoon sun. After the first few days of harvest season, clothing degenerated. Gloves developed holes in the tips. Exposed fingers grew numb from frost or bruised by rocks furtively concealed in the assigned potato rows. Pants and shoes dedicated to picking were caked with dirt and stank with the smell of rotten potatoes. On blustery days, wind usually blew from the northwest, gusting down across the fields, forcing thick, sticky dust into the nose, eyes, mouth, and any openings in the picker's clothes. The ubiquitous bandana wrapped tightly around the picker's face only provided marginal protection. Bernard habitually wore a navy blue bandana given to him by his mother. If it rained or snow fell after the potatoes had been overturned, the field needed to be picked clean, irrespective of the inclement weather. Micmac baskets were used to gather the potatoes and then carried to a barrel. Once filled, the barrel was ticketed with the picker's cardstock number, and the process began again. The most industrious laborers would fill 100 or more barrels in a day and were paid 25 cents a barrel. Weary bones, parched faces, dirty bodies, big appetites, and a few needed dollars was the end result of a hard day's work in the fields. In many respects, Bernard was weaned and toughened by that rigorous, austere environment. At the time, numerous families in the area were poor, but the Patterson family was more destitute than most. The late Northern National Bank teller Ola Orser recollected that Bernard frequently accompanied his mother into the bank when she cashed their potato-picking paychecks. In his youth, money always came hard for Bernard. Beginning at an early age, he learned that the bank on Main Street in Mars Hill was where one went to get needed cash. The first recollections that Doug Pierce had of Bernard was when they were in the second grade. Doug was much taller and stronger, while Bernard was small and wiry. The two got into a wrestling match the first time they met. Doug having successfully twisted Bernard's arm behind his back, Bernard did a complete somersault to escape the hold. Surprise and innovation were intuitive traits that Bernard possessed and effectively utilized throughout his life. Recalling that he was really tough and nimble, Pierce was one of his regular chums during grade school. When they played backyard football, Bernard was a real scrapper and one of the fastest runners. Crafty and sneaky, he was a bit of a loner. In the late 1950s, the Patterson family home, located at the top of York Street in Mars Hill, was lost to a devastating fire. That would be the first of several fires that would impact his life. With no place to live, the family split up and moved in various directions. The children were sent to homes that would take them in. His older brother George looked out for him and his siblings to the extent his limited means allowed. Bernard also lived sporadically with his uncle Grover Patterson in the adjacent community of Blaine for many years. Bernard lacked solid footing, a close friend regretfully observed. Years later, in a rare sentimental moment, Bernard would share the painful disappointment he felt with the absence of his mother for much of his youth. While he had outwardly accepted his childhood predicament with a stern, uncompromising stoicism, he expressed a deep inner resentment at being farmed out to multiple, sometimes unwilling family members as a kid. In Bernard's unforgiving world, there was little space for inner contentment. "He pretty much raised himself," observed frequent teenage companion Larry Donovan. "Bernard often didn't know if he had a place to sleep or not." Larry's father and sister would have a very unique and frightening encounter with Bernard a few years later. Larry and Bernard worked together in the potato houses after school and on weekends. Grimy, strenuous work, it was an assembly line process, with the potatoes shoveled into barrels, loaded on conveyor belts, sorted for quality, back onto belts, and then stuffed into 50 and 100-pound burlap bags that were stitched closed. The heavy sealed bags were loaded on trains and trucks. The dirtiest, lowest position in the line was down in the hole shoveling potatoes, and the worst job in the hole was emptying out rotten potatoes. The male workers periodically switched jobs so that all were relegated to time in the hole. Weighing in at a mere 120 pounds, Bernard hardened mentally and physically with the exhausting work. Paid $10 a day for his labors, that was big bucks in the early 1960s. Too poor to participate in organized sports, Bernard began working at an early age. When not laboring in the potato fields and houses, he cut wood in the forest and split firewood for kindling. Having his own money was very important to Bernard, providing independence and self-esteem. He started smoking cigarettes and drinking beer in his early teenage years, a habit he regularly indulged later in life. Marijuana was non-existent in northern Maine during that time. When not working, Bernard and his friends were frequently involved in minor delinquent behavior. In a prophetic portend of the future, he often carried a Bowie knife strapped to his leg. Cutting the loaded clotheslines of unsuspecting homemakers was just one of the activities he mischievously enjoyed with his unconventional toy. Larry remembers that he was not afraid of anybody or anything, but he was not a bully. As a teenager, he was reckless and unconcerned about consequences. When not misbehaving, they sometimes played basketball on the outdoor court at Harry Orser's house, even on the coldest winter days. Quiet in school, Bernard wasn't involved in formal extracurricular activities and didn't stand out. Although far from an academic, he excelled in studies when inclined. Attending Central Aroostook High School in Mars Hill, he didn't graduate. His high school principal, William Yersa, remembered that Bernard was in the class of 1967, but only for 1.5 years. Yersa discerned, "He had a lot on the ball, there was no question about it." Another teacher nostalgically opined, "Bernard could learn more in 2 days than the rest could in a week." According to Larry Donovan, he had a very bad attitude about school. He was too bright, bored with everything. He was bored with life. He had a high IQ, but not stimulated by school. Bernard left high school during his sophomore year in 1965. In early 1966, Bernard joined the Army. The Vietnam War was beginning to escalate. After boot camp and advanced infantry training, he was sent directly to Vietnam like thousands of his peers. 19 years old, Private Patterson was assigned to the 25th Infantry Division, which was located in Cu Chi Province, about 25 miles northwest of Saigon. The Cu Chi sector contained a vast tunnel network used by the Viet Cong for concealment. The tunnels were of great significance to the Viet Cong war effort and a major military obstacle for American forces. Not only was the enemy able to hide in them during the day only to steal out and attack at night, but they served as storage areas for supplies and ammunition. Larger, more elaborate complexes were used as living quarters for companies of Viet Cong and temporary homes for North Vietnamese army infiltrators. In 1966, U.S. troops conducted a major campaign, Operation Crimp, to destroy the Cu Chi tunnel system. Although it caused an immense amount of destruction to the jungle and terrain above ground, the effort essentially failed. By the time Bernard arrived, the Allied forces had adopted a new tactic and had begun training a courageous elite corps of men in tunnel warfare known as tunnel rats. Tunnel rats were an all-volunteer force, and for reasons known only to him, Bernard volunteered. And he kept volunteering. The normal tour of duty in Vietnam was 12 months, but he volunteered for an additional 2 years and was denied a request for another. Tunnel rats were a select cadre of mentally and physically tough, daring volunteers who were sent into the extensive, elaborate underground tunnel systems created by the Viet Cong. Their mission was simple, brutal, and extremely hazardous: kill the enemy and destroy their tunnels with explosives. Their motto was non gratum annus rodentum, literally Latin for not worth a rat's ass. The Cu Chi sector had the most substantial tunnel system in Vietnam. When a tunnel complex was located, tunnel rats were lowered into narrow holes in the ground to seek out the enemy. These attenuated tunnels traveled deep into the ground for hundreds of yards or more to lower levels where larger, more sophisticated facilities existed. While they provided a crude, extremely unpleasant existence for the inhabitants, they were the backbone of the Viet Cong resistance. Some of these underground fortifications were over 20 years old and often contained barracks for company-size units or larger, training areas, storage facilities, and more. Hospitals and entertainment rooms were built into the tunnel system, and there was one instance when comedian Bob Hope and his troupe were entertaining soldiers in the Cu Chi base camp while Viet Cong entertainers were simultaneously performing in a tunnel directly under them. On another occasion, an American tank was stolen, buried, and then used as an underground Viet Cong command post. Usually equipped with only a pistol, bayonet, and a flashlight, tunnel rats frequently entered this dank, murky, hellish world alone in search of the Viet Cong. Infested with booby traps and the enemy often waiting in ambush, the tunnels were perilous in the extreme. Sometimes they encountered poison gas. A few tunnel rats wore gas masks, but many entered without them as the masks impeded breathing, visibility, and their ability to hear, senses essential to survival. Booby traps could consist of sophisticated small explosives or something as rudimentary as well-placed bamboo lances designed to impale those unaware of their existence. Other creatures haunted the tunnels, such as snakes, rats, and scorpions. Venomous snakes and rats infected with the bubonic plague were sometimes left as living booby traps. Water traps were U-shaped dips built into the tunnel complex to prevent the injection of tear gas into the system. When encountered, they required tunnel rats to submerge and swim to the other side, gambling that they'd find nothing but putrid air.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?